Well, hi once again, and welcome to Unstoppable Mindset. As usual, we hope to have a lot of fun today. We have a great guest, Terra Davis. She's got a lot to talk about, I am sure. She's involved in diversity, equity, and inclusion. She's a graduate of Howard University. And the most important thing about Terra, the absolutely most important thing is that she likes to visit ice cream stores who claim they're the best. And so we definitely need to delve into that. Well, welcome to Unstoppable Mindset, and thank you for being here.
Thank you, Michael.
So let's get into this ice cream store business. Who do you think is the best so far?
So I grew up in a very small town in New Jersey, in South Jersey to be exact. And so I grew up around a bunch of mom and pop ice cream stores, if you will, for most of my life. And I have to give a shout out to Creanie's Ice Cream. They are locally owned and they have incredible ice cream. But if I'm looking at the big retailer ice creams spots that you could find all over the country, Jenny's Ice Cream is definitely one that I would recommend as the up and coming.
So when I lived in Westfield, we would go over to, I think it was in Cranford or Scotch Plains, Scoops, which I and people who worked for me loved to go to. So we had a lot of fun going to Scoops and thought it was pretty good. I wouldn't say it's the best, but it was definitely something that made life worthwhile for us. And so we always enjoyed Scoops.
I'll have to check that out.
Yeah, I don't know if they're there. Where do you live now?
So now I'm in Dallas, Texas.
You're in Dallas. So yeah, it's a little far from Scoops, but
a little far. But when I travel, I try to make it a mission of mine to go out and find an ice cream spot.
The best place I ever experienced was in Berkeley, a place called Bots. And I learned about it from Hazel Tenbrook, who was the wife, now the late wife, of the founder of the National Federation of the Blind, Dr. Jacobus Tenbrook. And the family had their biggest meal of the day at breakfast because that was when everybody was together. And also, if you ate a big meal at breakfast, you didn't need to eat as much the rest of the day and you had more energy. And one of the things that they did was they would go down the hill from where they lived on Shattuck Road and go to Botz's ice cream store company and buy a quart of ice cream that had to weigh, if it was a quart, 2.5 pounds.
Oh my gosh.
And it was about the richest and the most wonderful ice cream I think that I have ever experienced. It isn't there anymore. There was another one, I think, in San Francisco called Bud's, which was pretty good. And I think it's still around somewhere, but Bots was always great. Loved it.
Well, Baldo's here in Dallas is phenomenal too.
Well, we're just going to have to get to Dallas and go with you and do an ice cream tour.
Please do.
So now that we've dealt with the substantive part of the podcast, tell me a little bit about you growing up and all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, so I mentioned I grew up in a really small town in South Jersey, and I was about 15, 20 minutes outside of Philadelphia. And when most people think of New Jersey, they oftentimes think about New York. And they never think about the southern part of this itty bitty state. But that is where I grew up. And I grew up in a house of educators. My mom and my dad are both teachers, and they have been in the industry for a very long time. And they really instilled upon me the importance of, one, education, of course, but also just treating people well. And my dad, actually, his father was the NAACP president of his local chapter in New Jersey. And my grandmother was very involved in the NAACP and also in the civil rights movement as well, and met, between the two of them, a lot of civil rights pioneers who they would invite over to their home, they would invite to come and speak. And so my dad really growing up around that could never leave that and would oftentimes tell stories to my sister and I about some of those experiences. And I think that now, DEI is a part of what I get paid to do, but it's always been a part of who I am as a result of just who I have in my life and their own experiences.
So you've been enculturated, if you will, into the civil rights world, especially right from the very beginning.
From the very beginning.
So what was, yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead.
What was it like going to school?
It was so undergrad was amazing. I was actually just speaking to someone about this the other day because at the time I didn't realize that I wanted to go to Howard University. I knew a little bit about its legacy, and it really wasn't until I stepped foot on campus that I knew that that was the place that I was meant to be at. I really valued not only the professors, but the conversations that we were having about racial injustice and what that looked like from a systemic approach, even though my major was in journalism, I wasn't necessarily, and I didn't have this in my mind as something that I would be doing later on. It was just embedded in everything that we did in every class that we took. And on top of all of that, I really learned just how broad the diaspora is, if you will, of Black people, not only in the United States, but outside of the United States. I think growing up in a really small town, I grew up in a bubble where the people who I saw who looked like me, we shared very similar cultural values because of the area in which we grew up. But going to Howard University, it really expanded my view of others who might be Black and living in Sacramento, Black and living in New York, Black and living in Cincinnati, Ohio. And one of the things that I think is so important in that is understanding that people and cultures aren't necessarily a monolith. And it really depends on your environment and your lived experiences. And so I think that it was one of the greatest teachers, was just being there at the university to be able to learn that.
What was it like when you were younger, going to elementary and secondary school and so on, in terms of how you were treated or what your environment was like and how things were?
It was lonely, but not. I mean, the area that I grew up in was not very diverse at all. And so for me, I would usually be the one of only person of color, Black person in my classroom or in my classes. And that can be an isolating feeling when you realize, because there's a moment that you realize that you don't necessarily know it going in. But when you realize that you are one of one or one of a few, it can become increasingly very lonely and very isolating. And usually I would find myself getting picked to answer the questions around Black culture, especially during Black History Month, which will be next month.
Yeah.
And there's tremendous weight in being responsible for an entire group of people that, like I said, I learned, just depending on your environment and your lived experiences, we all have different views and vantage points. And so to have to speak for an entire culture, there was a tremendous amount of pressure. I think that also growing up at the same time, in that environment and going to elementary, middle school in these areas that weren't very diverse, it really prevented me from having the opportunity to get to know people from other cultures that weren't white or Caucasian. And so it really wasn't until probably later in middle school, and certainly not until high school, that I was able to interact with other demographics and get a better understanding of who a person was and what they believed, and how their culture influenced their behavior and their personality. And it felt like it was done. It was such a meaningful experience for me, especially when I would watch friends or peers who hadn't had that opportunity and hadn't had those experiences and had these stereotypical viewpoints in their minds of who people were or are.
Did you grow in any way to accept the concept that being one of a few or the only one maybe also gave you the opportunity to be a teacher, or was there just too much pressure that just didn't really strike you or seem like it was a relevant thing to do? And I'll tell you why I asked that, because we who happen to have physical disabilities as our characteristics, and I'll talk about specifically blindness, most of the time we're the only one. And today, as an adult especially, again, the only one that most people interact with, and people are always asking questions. And so you can resent that, you can accept it, you can decide, well, this is a chance to educate. How did you react to all of that, or how has your view changed over time? Possibly is a better question to ask.
Oh, I welcomed it. I think I'm a unicorn in that sense, because I took it on as an opportunity for someone not to walk away from our conversation the same way that they entered.
Mm-hmm.
And so that way, when they met someone else who looked like me, they had a better understanding of who that person might be because of it. They also knew that there were some things about me that were not necessarily what those persons saw on television or read in the newspaper when the newspapers were around, or it just what they thought of. And so I really welcomed it, because I thought that it broke barriers when we had those conversations. And also, I don't want anyone to be walking on this earth ignorant when they don't have to be.
Mm-hmm.
And ignorant in the truest sense of its definition, of just not knowing. And so if I'm around, I feel comfortable with someone asking me those questions and wanting to understand it. I got questions about my hair. I got questions about the music that I like, the food that I eat, my family. And then some of the more uncomfortable things about what people might see on television, and the different portrayal of Black people and fiction, and also in documentary form, that I was able, I hope, to shed more light on.
It's interesting the way you describe it, and I understand it fully for lots of reasons. Do you find it at all interesting or amazing that so often people are uncomfortable just because someone looks different than them?
I find it just a part of the human condition, especially when you have this upbringing where And this was the case, especially where I grew up, where if you don't want to, you will never have to see anyone else who doesn't look like you. Um, or who doesn't have an experience very similar to you. You never have to experience that person or see that, at least in the very early stages of your life.
Mhm.
And, one of the things that I've observed that most people will, depending on where they are living, will spend more time with people that look like them outside of the workplace. And when they're at work, if their workplace is just slightly diverse, they will find themselves interacting with coworkers, but only during the 9 to 5 time. And then once 5 o'clock hits, it's like I'm back to my world with my one group that I feel very comfortable with. And I really challenge that. I
Yeah.
think that there's a space and place for you to be around like-minded individuals and those individuals who look like you and have very similar experiences to you. I think that that's healthy, but I also believe that you should challenge yourself a bit. And because for me, I didn't have the choice to just be in one environment. Um, I didn't have that. I didn't have that as an option. And from the 9 to 5, even past the 5, that's not necessarily an option for me, especially depending on where I'm living at the time. And for some people, especially those who are in the, I wouldn't say, I'm saying majority, but I'm saying it very loosely, who are in the majority, you don't necessarily have to, you have to be more intentional about it.
Mhm.
And so I challenge it, but I think it's
Mhm.
all just a part of the human condition.
Well, it's part of the human environment, but we also don't need to allow ourselves to be conditioned that way. For me, for example, I don't focus on what people look like. Um, Color is pretty much for me, for example, a meaningless concept. I understand it. I understand and could talk to you about it from a physics standpoint all day long. But it amazes me that anyone of one color could look down on someone else from another color, because for me, it's irrelevant. And maybe I'm very fortunate. I do know blind people who are and have learned to be prejudiced, but I don't know that, especially if they're totally blind from birth, whether they truly understand the whole color concept. But it's still very fascinating that we can look at someone and who, just because they look different than us, another color or any number of other characteristics, can decide that we're less than they are, especially when the they is the typical white majority. And there are more white people than in this country, especially, than there are other people, although that is slowly evolving. But still, I think that each race or each color tends to have some of that attitude where we tend to not be comfortable around the people that look different than us. And for me, that's kind of really just an amazing concept.
It is for me too. And I noticed growing up the people who are very uncomfortable. I mean, I'm a woman, and so the uncomfortability that I experience is so much different from my spouse, who's a man, who's a Black man. His level of what he experiences in terms of people who are uncomfortable around him is much more heightened. People are usually afraid of him when he's walking down the street, and we can definitely see that. And for me, I could pretty much go up to anyone and I can sense that they might be uncomfortable from the start, but it's much easier and faster to break down that barrier than it is for him, especially with like the preconceived notions and ideas that they might have about him.
Mm-hmm. I remember once going with my wife to a restaurant for breakfast. My wife was in a wheelchair her whole life, so she too looked different. And she passed away this past November. But I have 40 years of memories, so that works. But we went into this restaurant for breakfast and went up to the counter, and the woman behind the counter, as I learned later, just kind of stood there looking between us, because me being blind doesn't necessarily make direct always eye contact. And Karen being shorter and in a wheelchair, this woman didn't know who to talk to, just to say, would you like a table or a booth or anything like that? And so she stood there mute. And finally, Karen said to me, I don't think the hostess knows who to talk to or what to ask. And so I said, well, she could ask us if we want breakfast and where we want to sit and all that, and we could kind of go from there. And that did break the ice. I'm sure she was a little bit embarrassed, but then she did ask all the right questions, and we went and we sat down and we ate, and people were comfortable with us. But it is just amazing that we can live in a world where we're taught. And I believe that's really the issue, is that we're taught to think that people, because they look different or have some characteristics that we don't, are different and not necessarily as good as we are. We are taught that all too often. And it's a problem that we have to address at some point. When we talk about diversity, the problem that some of us have with diversity is it is completely thrown out disabilities. When you ask people to describe what diversity means, they'll talk about race, sexual orientation, gender, and so on, social justice and other things. You never hear disabilities mentioned, or so rarely that it doesn't even count to do it, which is unfortunate. But then they talk about DEI and they describe it as the same. And my position is you can't do that if you're going to talk about inclusion. Either you are inclusive or you're not. And that really means you got to change your mindset and recognize that people who have so-called disabilities are really part of the world. And as I describe it, disability needs to be learned as something that does not mean a lack of ability, but just a characteristic. And it's amazing how we are so stuck in our attitudes about how to deal with all of that.
Oh, absolutely. I have watched people retreat as soon as they encounter someone with a disability, especially a physical disability.
Yeah.
And I guess one where, and also a disability that is visible, because there are some mental disabilities that are visible, but
Right.
the ones that are invisible, it takes time to actually have a discussion and talk to someone, and sometimes that person then has to disclose it in order for you to know. And then all of a sudden it turns into this, all right, now how should I act around you? What should I do? And I find that fascinating as well. And also that the DEI conversations that we're having, it seems like the country as a whole is starting to get comfortable being uncomfortable discussing race, discussing ethnicity, discussing gender, discussing even sexual expression and orientation. And when it comes to disabilities and neurodiversity, all of a sudden it's like retreat, retreat, retreat.
Because we're afraid that we could become like you. And one of the things that we have to somehow get the world to understand is, so what? So you become like me. Does that mean that you're less of an individual? And I know so many people who have had to go through the rehabilitation process, people who have become paralyzed or blind or whatever, and they go through a process. And most of the time, I'm again dealing with blindness, but most of the time the agencies will teach you to use some technologies and so on, but they don't really get to the root issue of attitude and philosophy. It's a fairly small number of agencies that truly will work to get their clients to understand that blindness is okay. It may be taking a different lane down the road of life, but you're still on the road of life. And it is something that we just tend not to deal with. And a lot of the professionals in the field of work for the blind, although they would deny it, truly don't have a great positive attitude about blindness themselves. And so the result of that is that they tend to operate in a way where they're not really helping people who come to them to live up to or learn to live up to their full potential. It is still such a fear that we haven't dealt with.
For sure. And not knowing how to respond. I remember watching that with my grandfather, who I mentioned, who did all these incredible things and was president of his local NAACP chapter, and he was a World War II vet, but he was blind as well. And he wasn't blind his entire life, but but my entire life, that's what I knew of him. And I remember watching people who would meet him for the first time. He was well over 6 foot and had a very deep voice that commanded your attention, and had that type of personality as well. But I would watch people want to treat him with kid gloves and treat him as if he was a child, in a sense.
Yeah.
Because of the fact that he was blind. Yeah. And he didn't need that treatment. He would very quickly let you know in his own way that, you know, he was this powerhouse of a person. But it just always intrigued me to watch people who would meet him for the very first time, who just felt that.
I'm amazed when somebody meets me, maybe I've talked with them on the phone or whatever, and they say, "You didn't sound blind." And I'm sitting there going, "What the heck does that mean?" Oh, well, you know, no.
Right.
It's amazing. Well, you know, you went to Howard University. Then what did you do?
So after I graduated from Howard, I ended up sort of falling into, I really didn't know what I wanted to do next. I knew that it wasn't going to be journalism in the traditional sense. And I knew that my passion and my gift was in communications. I just didn't know where to put that. And I sort of fell into this place where I found myself doing more of like corporate communications, and somehow, some way ended up in the legal world.
Did you major in journalism?
I did.
Ah, okay. Just wondering how you got there.
Oh, yeah.
Another one of those reporters, eh?
And there just so happened to be these law firms that were looking for people with journalism and communications backgrounds, because they needed people to be able to write and write well, and write in a way that, as a journalist who's writing for someone who may only have a 5th grade education, or you're writing for the ear, someone who is very simple to understand. Like I don't need to do a whole lot to get the point of what you're trying to say. And so I fell into this legal industry. And one of the things that I quickly realized was that I was in an environment very similar to the environment that I grew up in, the environment that I went to elementary school and middle school in, where there was maybe one or two of me, and there might be more people who were serving as in roles that weren't necessarily business professional roles, like and like executive positions. And then also there wasn't a whole lot of diversity with the lawyers, and I wanted to understand why that was. And so I started asking questions, and I started attending different events and noticing the same thing in the legal industry over and over and over again. And I really wanted to change that. I really wanted to be that person who not only increased the diversity so it looked like the world in which we live in, but one where someone who looks like me can come in and feel comfortable being themselves there and not feel like they have to wear a mask when they're working and when they're with their peers. And then when they go home, they can take that mask off and there's a sense of relief.
Yeah. It's amazing that we hide so much sometimes, isn't it?
It is. It is. And I noticed that, I mean, maybe also this is probably in other industries. This is probably also in the medical field, and it's probably also in the corporate world when you look at it, that there are so many people who just feel like they cannot be authentically them. They feel like they have to speak a certain way and they have to have a certain educational background and a certain familial background, and they also need to potentially come from money, and they need to dress a certain way in order to just be accepted. And we spend so much of our time at work, more time at work than we do at home with our family and with our friends. And that can become exhausting. And not only can it become exhausting, it can hurt you mentally, it can hurt you physically, it can hurt you emotionally. And I knew, coming from Howard University, I didn't want that for my life. I didn't want to go to a workplace where I couldn't be myself.
Mm-hmm. Why do you think that circumstances like that tend to be the case? Why is it that in the legal profession, where we are supposed to not pay attention to those kinds of things, and that we're supposed to really work for justice for all, why do you think that still the prevailing attitudes are as you describe them?
I think it's the systems that are set up. And I think that it is, for a long time in the legal industry, and in particular, the corporate legal industry, what I believe has been happening is those who are diverse don't always have, didn't always, let me say not right now, but let me say didn't always have the means or way to get into law school, mm-hmm. to go to law school, and to succeed in law school. Mm-hmm. And so you end up with this oneness of graduates who complete the program, who go to the top schools, who have the best grades, and then they go into this corporate law firm setting and they create their own culture that mirrors the culture that they're used to.
It gets back to society dictating this whole concept of you need to be stereotyped in a certain way, and there's no allowance for difference.
Absolutely. Absolutely. There's none. It's as if difference is something that is similar to having a cold or something that's not necessarily supposed to be in your body, that your body rejects as a result. And I feel like difference is viewed the exact same way. It's like, oh no, this is something that isn't right to have, and we need to reject it.
Do you think that with more people, say, who are Black or of other cultures, and I would hope over time, and I think there's some of this that is happening, people with disabilities going into a law environment, a legal environment, do you think that this will change any of the attitudes of not really tolerating difference and so on that we see, or are they just going to conform to the system?
Oh, I definitely think the attitudes will change. I'm seeing it right now where there is an intolerance for not accepting the change and not welcoming it and being resistant to that. And I'm watching it with the policies that are created. I'm watching it with the positions that are being created to make sure that the culture reflects an environment that is much more welcoming and inclusive. I I have hope. I also believe that there's this younger generation that's coming in, and the world in which they live looks much differently than the world that I grew up in and the world that others who come before me have lived in. And I think that they just don't have the patience for that type of environment. And I definitely am seeing a shift. If I didn't see the shift before, when I first came into this industry, which I hadn't seen those things happening, I definitely saw it in 2020. And I am hoping to see that continue to evolve and expand beyond some of the groups that we spoke about. And I'm hoping to see that expand into disabilities more than it has already. I think that we are due for a shift.
And that will be a good thing if that can truly happen. That will be a really exciting thing to see. And I hope that it does. Where do you work?
So I actually work at a firm called Norton Rose Fulbright.
So you actually are at a law firm.
I am at a law firm.
And do you, well, so what exactly do you do there?
So I am a DEI manager, and my primary responsibility is to ensure that the clients that we have that are really looking to us to make the change as well and see equitable opportunities for diverse attorneys and inclusive practices adopted, that it's happening. And so what I'm doing is I'm communicating that with our clients, and I'm collaborating with our clients on those efforts and coming up with what I hope are good ideas to make sure that we aren't moving backward and that we're moving forward and that we are actually practicing what we preach and walking the walk and not just talking the talk.
As a person who clearly has some deep thoughts and good ideas and knowledge about this whole concept of inclusion and so on, do you get ever to be involved in any writing of legal arguments and so on, or other things to ensure that things are presented in the most inclusive way, or do you get to be involved in that end of the legal aspect of it just because of your journalism background? And clearly you're a great communicator.
Thank you. No, I don't. I'm not involved in the legal aspects of everything. I save that for everyone who went through their years of law school and passed the bar. What I am really inspired by are the written policies that firms like mine are putting down to paper to institutionalize inclusive practices so that those things can only get built upon and not erased for the next person entering that is looking for an environment that is one that they can thrive in. And so what I'm really looking at is, what do we talk about having persons with disabilities and making life a lot easier for them in the workplace, but what accommodations do we have in place? We talk about the fact that we would like to see more LGBTQ plus attorneys in the workspace, but how are we allowing them to be their true and authentic selves and not feel like that's a part of them that they have to hide when they come into the office every day? So really what I'm looking at are more of the policies and best practices and things that make someone not only want to work for a firm like mine, but want to stay.
And that, of course, is really the issue. It isn't just getting there, but it's wanting to stay. And good work environment, a positive work environment is, of course, second to none anywhere.
Absolutely. I mean, I don't know how many cultural statements I read on various websites of companies and firms that said, we value our people, just the standard language. And then, when you get into those places, you find that none of what they've communicated on their website or in their handbook is necessarily how it is. And so I believe in training. I believe in uncomfortable conversations for the betterment of the place that you are at. I believe in, like I said, adopting policies that are put to paper, but I think DEI work at its core, and I know others in the space will argue with me on this, is valuing and accepting people, but also caring for them for just who they are and not expecting them to assimilate or conform themselves into something that they're not.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, someone could argue and say, well, does that mean that I believe in this? And I believe in, I don't believe in gay marriage. And I come into the workplace, does that then mean that I shouldn't have to work with someone who is gay? And I absolutely challenge that, because I think that everything that we do as DEI practitioners should be rooted in a place of love and acceptance. And at the end of the day, when we're building up in what we're doing, that should be the foundation that we look to in what we're doing. Like, is this built in a place of love and acceptance?
Yeah, it's the usual thing that we tend not to tolerate difference very well. What my view about whether gay people should marry or not is really irrelevant as far as they're concerned. It's their choice. And, I'm amazed when people talk about God and religion and this isn't right in the Bible. But Jesus also said, render under Caesar what is Caesar, render under God what is God's. And the reality is, ultimately, if there is a problem, no matter what it is, that goes against God, that's up to that individual and God to deal with. And there'll be a time that they have to do that, but it's not my place to judge that.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of things are also just built with fear. And I think we have to check that. I think that we find ourselves when we find ourselves saying no, because we have to really take a look at why we're saying no. And if there's some fear attached to that no, then it's probably not a good reason to say no.
Mm-hmm.
And I think when it comes to DEI work, there's resistance more often than not because of fear of the unknown. And we've got to do, I think, a better job of leaning into that fear and understanding, well, where is this coming from and why are we doing that and why does that need to be maintained?
Also, the fear of the unknown is easily addressed because what is unknown, especially in this kind of environment with what we're talking about, can certainly become known. People can learn more if they will.
They can. I mean, unlike, especially when I was in college and even before then, the tools and access that I had were very limited. And so it took a much more conscious approach and effort to get to the information that I needed to get to. And now, I mean, we all have cell phones, and our cell phones are little mini computers, and we can get that information right there. I mean, it's discerning what information is the right information to
Yeah.
have. But I think just using it as an excuse as I just didn't know and I didn't understand is not one that we can lean on anymore.
I know for me, just picking up a cell phone and doing that kind of research willy nilly at the drop of a hat is a little bit more of a challenge and slower to do. But I'm amazed when I go to family gatherings and so on, somebody makes a comment. Um, what I discover is everybody's on their computers or actually their cell phones or their iPads looking up the information and talking about what they read, which I think is exactly what you're saying. The information is there if we would but take advantage of looking for it and using it and learning from it.
Absolutely.
And it is so much of an information oriented world, and the information is there. The internet is such a treasure trove. It is amazing that more people don't do it and use it. And I realize that we have a lot of our population that is growing older, and they tend to not gravitate to it as fast. But I think even if they would be amazed and would discover an incredible world that they could learn a whole lot more about, which would benefit them and everyone else.
If we were doing a privilege walk as a country, one of the things that we would all be able to step forward for is technology, I think, at some capacity. So I agree with you on that. It's just how far do you want to step out of your comfort zone to access the information?
That's exactly it, of course. It's always all about moving out of your comfort zone. We tend, once we get used to something, we just don't want to change what we do. And there's nothing wrong with taking a little bit of risk. It doesn't mean that you have to jump out of an airplane with or without a parachute, but you can certainly learn a lot more about skydiving. And maybe you'd find out, well, maybe this would be fun to do or not. Personally, I am not interested in jumping out of an airplane, even with a parachute. But I also know that if I were in a situation where I needed to do it, I could adopt a mindset that says, okay, that's what I got to do. I know that much about me, whether I want to do it or not, I can still do it. And probably that comes from being a risk taker most of my life and going to strange places, doing things that I never thought I would do, things that other people take for granted. But for me, it's a new experience or something that, as I said, involves, from my perspective, taking risks, but that's okay too. Nothing wrong with a little risk to make life more fun and exciting and adventurous.
Not at all.
It's always a good thing to do. So, what would be one thing that you think um, people should learn or know that they don't know about this whole idea of inclusion that we're talking about?
There are so many things that I think people should know, but if I had to drill down on just one thing, it's really going back to what we were speaking about, which is it only takes you. it only takes you to step outside of your comfort zone to want to understand, to want to learn, to want to grow in this space. And I think what ends up happening is we lean on people like myself who are dedicating our profession to this area and not realizing how much we can influence it on our own.
You live in a world where you're constantly being challenged, you're facing differences and so on, and it has to get from time to time frustrating, speaking from experience. What motivates you? What's keeping you motivated?
What's been keeping me motivated lately is remembering why I started to do this in the first place. When I got into this, I would say when I decided to dedicate my time to this and move away from what I had initially been doing, which was that communication side of everything, I was sitting in a hospital bed. I had just given birth to my daughter, and George Floyd's funeral was on.
Mm.
And I remember one of the hospital workers who was responsible for taking vitals and cleaning out the rooms. She came in my room and she stood by me, and we didn't really know each other all that well at all, because you're only in the hospital but for so many days after you give birth. And we were in the room in silence watching the funeral. And immediately we're connected from that. And I think when I go back after a challenging day and I remember the way that I felt watching it and the way that I was able to connect with the stranger watching it, it reminds me that there is greater good in doing the work that I'm doing that far outweighs the challenges that I have in a day.
Mm-hmm. Even so, what keeps you up at night? Obviously, there are a lot of things that go on and weigh on your mind because of all this. So what keeps you up at night?
Hoping that people get it, hoping that people get what I do and why it's so important. And and understand that I know as of late, there's been a huge focus and a huge driver when it comes to DEI work around the dollar, and that there's monetary gain in focusing on diversity. And while I know that that is true, I what keeps me up at night is hoping that we can see a deeper reason beyond the monetary gain in this. And that when we look at, and I hate to say this because it sounds so speechy, right? But and so motivational, like, but when we look at our kids, and when I look at my daughter's 2 now, when I look at her and when I look at her friends, and I think about the type of world that they're going to be in, and I think about the type of workplace that they'll be working in, and the hurdles that I faced when I first got into the workplace, or the hurdles I faced just at school because I was different. I would like to believe that people aren't looking at making it better for them just for the sake of money. I would like to believe that people are looking to make it a bit better for them because that's just the right thing to do and because there's such good in it.
What is one thing you've done a lot of things and you've had some pretty amazing experiences, but what's one thing that you haven't done that you'd like to do in addition to finding more ice cream stores?
Huh. I think that I would definitely hope to. We talked about risk earlier, and I'd like to be able to take many more risks than I have so far. I'd like to challenge myself in specific areas inside and outside of this work. And risk for me is just is trying something new, not necessarily skydiving, but trying something new in a slightly different environment. And I am hoping that I am able to find what that looks like in the next couple of years for me and take that leap.
What's one thing that you can think of, or can you think of something right now as an example of taking that risk that you haven't taken?
I would have to say that right now, the risk that I haven't necessarily taken or pursued in a way that would be beneficial for me is understanding more about these leadership roles and these executive positions in this space, understanding a bit more about social impact through a DEI lens. I'd like to see myself not only learning more about that, but stepping into that a bit more.
Makes a lot of sense. And I think makes for an interesting adventure. And when you do that, we want to have you come back so we can hear more about how it all went too.
I would love that.
What would you like your legacy to be? How would you like people to remember you? I'm just kind of curious.
As someone who genuinely cared, as someone who not only genuinely cared, but when I get up in the morning, my challenge to myself is to make sure that I am influential in a way where it's getting someone else closer to where they want to be and what they're hoping to achieve. And doing it in a way where, because of what they look like, because of who they are, isn't the reason why they can't get to those things. Mm-hmm. And so I'd like my legacy to be the person that helped them do that. And even if it's not thousands of people and it's just a few, I'd feel good about that. And even if they don't know my name and they don't know that the thing that I did in a piece of what helped them was something that I did, I'm okay with that. But that's what I'd like my legacy to be.
At the end of the day, or each day, do you ever just take time to sit back and think internally and think about what happened in the course of the day and do self-assessment of what was good, what wasn't, how to maybe improve the things that weren't, or what could you have done better that even worked out great right from the outset? Sort of self-analysis, introspection?
All the time. It's It's when people ask you the question of what's a weakness of yours, it, introspective thinking is definitely one of mine. And at the same time, it's a strength because I think that it's important to do that because then you can learn from the day or in the events that happened in that day. At the same time, it hurts me when I fall into this negative thought pattern around those things. I was just talking to someone about this not that long ago about how I can get so caught up in my head thinking about the things that I should have said, should have done, that I can miss the good things that happened. And I can miss the things that went right because I'm holding myself to the fire to do everything the right way and say all the things that I needed to say. And that's just not how our lives work. If they did work that way, I don't think we'd ever grow.
And putting things in, as you say, the right way, the fact is the right way might need to evolve or will evolve over time because what seems right maybe needs to change sometimes.
Oh, absolutely. I was just listening to someone, so Sirius XM, and I was driving home from picking my daughter up from school, and I was listening to someone who was asking the question of the day, which was, what things did you used to believe or stand by that no longer serve you, or you've now realized that that's not a part of who you are, your core value, or what you believe anymore. And it was interesting to hear some of the things that people thought about and what their responses were to that question. And you're exactly right. The right thing might be right now in this moment, in this second, but it's not necessarily going to be the right thing in the next month or the next year or the next few years. Think about all the things that this country thought were right at the time, and they just simply, and they could have been for that person or those individuals, and then later on we come to find out they weren't the right thing.
Yeah. It's fascinating to think about it, and I think we all need to look at evolving our thought processes. And I'm a firm believer in introspection and a firm believer in evaluating us, each other, ourselves every day. We're our best teachers. We're going to be the ones who can teach us the best. And we really should take advantage of that. It's a wonderful gift.
It absolutely is. I'm thankful for the gift. Like I said, I'm thankful for when I'm able to do it in a way that isn't bringing me down, and isn't serving me in a way that's helping me get to the point of growth that I need to be. And it's how I live. It's how I plan for my next few days. It's how I plan my life. Really, is just having those quiet moments to myself, and some of that comes in journaling as well.
Yeah, I have never been a great journaler, but I understand it, and I tend to just try to think about things and keep things in my mind. But I do, from time to time, find ways to make sure that I will remember things. I find reminders and other things that my little echo device and other things can do to remind me are very important things to do. So I appreciate the whole concept of journaling and vision mapping and so on, and treasure mapping, because they are extremely important tools if we would use them to remind us and keep us centered.
Absolutely.
Well, Terra, this has been absolutely fun. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I certainly have. I think that we have talked about a lot of things and given each other, and hopefully you who are listening out there, lots to think about. And I really am serious. We need to do it again, especially when you take a few of those risks and want to come back and talk about it. I am ready to do it whenever you are.
Thank you, Michael. I enjoyed my time. This has been a great discussion. And you really had me thinking with several of these questions. I'm going to go back and look at my journal tonight and then start to map out. I've so appreciated it, and I would love to join you again.
Well, we will have to absolutely do it. And I told you this would be a conversation, and we'd go in all sorts of directions that probably never thought of doing at the beginning. But I appreciate all of your help in preparing for it. And I appreciate you and your time, and very much looking forward to the chance to do it again. I hope that you listening will give us a 5-star rating. Go to Apple or wherever, and please rate the podcast. It's valuable and it helps us a lot. And also, I would appreciate it if you want to make comments. Feel free to do so. You can email me. You can do comments with your ratings, but I'm always ready to receive emails. You can send me an email at mike@michaelhinkson.com. Better yet, do Michael H.I. at accessibe, accessibe.com. How, Terra, can people reach out to you?
You can certainly reach out to me on LinkedIn. You can find my name, Terra Davis, Davis. And that's really the best way to reach out to me, honestly. I found myself getting off of social media slowly but surely over time. It was
too time consuming.
It's too time consuming, but certainly on LinkedIn.
Well, I hope that you all will respond and let us know what you thought. And you'll be back with us again next time when we do Unstoppable Mindset. You are also, if you need to learn more about some of our other podcasts, welcome to go to www.michaelhinkson.com/podcast and check us out and listen to some of our past episodes. Also, I would just tell you, I do keynote speaking, and if there's ever an opportunity where you feel that I might be able to add value and come and talk to your organization or some organization that you know, please reach out to me. I'd love to hear from you. But again, Terra, this has been fun, and thank you again for being a part of this and giving us all of your time today.
Likewise, thank you for having me.